stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Welcome to Powers Powwow on the road at the Masonic Temple in Detroit on Temple Street. We're being brought to enlightenment by Rob Moore. Rob, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am an active Mason here at the Detroit Masonic Temple. I am a member of 2 lodges that meet here. I currently am the docent for the building. I'm also the executive director of the library and archive here. So, and I also work for the building in a full-time capacity, so I wear a lot of hats here. So.
Oh, how long have you been doing this?
I have been a Mason here since 2007. I've been doing tours since 2009. I have been coordinating the tours since 2016.
And what room are we in right now?
We are currently in the Greek Ionic Lodge room. It's Ionic because of the columns in the room are of the Ionic architectural style. The thing at the top, which is called the volute, is the curvature on that. That is, in the classical architectural tradition, that is the Ionic architectural style. Greek because the inspiration behind this room is of the temple of Diana at Ephesus in ancient Greece. So that was the ancient Greek temple that this room was inspired by.
And is this where you meet, or?
Yes, this is an active lodge room. This is the last lodge room in the building that still operates on a timeshare basis. At one time, the building had 35 active Masonic lodges. Currently there are 6. So at one time you had activity in the lodge rooms from Monday through Friday evenings. This is the last lodge room that still operates on that premise. You have meetings in here Tuesday nights, Wednesday nights, and Thursday nights. You
have tours constantly through the year?
Typically we run the public tours on the 1st and 3rd Sundays of the month at 3 p.m. Tickets are available at our website, www.themasonic.com, under our events listing section. We can also do custom date tours as well. Typically for the custom date tours, we need at least a minimum of 1 week's notice, and that depends on whether there's that date is a good date and whether we have a guide available. We do have group rates available for Masonic groups as well as for nonprofit organizations, so that is something that we can do if we have an available date and someone to do the tour.
And you have weddings here? And
oh yes, the Masonic Temple is actually in the top 10 listings for wedding destinations in the state of Michigan. We do them in most of the rooms throughout the building. The Commandery Asylum on the 3rd floor is typically the most popular setting for weddings because of the way it looks. It's designed after a classical Gothic cathedral, but we do have the weddings in the lodge rooms. We've had them in the smaller of the 2 theaters, so we're a very popular wedding destination, particularly in the warmer months as well. So.
Well, I've heard you have something that happens here during Halloween also.
Yes, that is our Theater Bazaar. Theater Bazaar has been active since, I believe, the early 2000s. It's been in the Masonic Temple here since 2011. During the month of October, it takes up pretty much most of the public parts of the building. It's down everywhere from the Crystal Ballroom in the sub-basement all the way up to the 4th floor lobby. It's trying to find the right words to describe it. It's kind of like a really large-scale masquerade type party with, it has all sorts of different variety acts. It has a burlesque show, it has musical acts, it has some fire performers, tightrope walkers. It's kind of like a really fun themed type event centered around Halloween, centered around it's an amazing sensory experience, and yeah, that takes place during the month of October, and it's a really fun time throughout the building.
Okay, and then they can look on the Masonic website and find out when all these things happen?
That's correct, yeah. It's www.themasonic.com.
All right, well, thank you. And how long is the tour?
The tours typically go for about 2.5 hours.
Okay, so we're going to get ready for the tour.
Yep.
Thank you. Peace out.
This is the largest Masonic building in the world, 210 feet tall, 550,000 square feet, 1,037 rooms. We're not going to see them all today. Yes, the Masons still own it. It's owned by the Masonic Temple Association, which is a consortium made up of representatives of each of the Masonic bodies that meet in the Masonic Temple. There are 11 total Masonic groups in the building.
So we are now in the main lobby of the Detroit Masonic Temple. This lobby has been maintained almost exactly as it was the day that the temple opened on November 1926. The architect of the temple was George D. Mason, and the primary designer was a man by the name of Corrado Parducci. You may be familiar with Parducci because his work can be found throughout the city of Detroit, but this was really his first major project. He came to Detroit as a young man in his 20s and ended up with the design contract for the interior and exterior of the building. The building is a neo-Gothic style building. Neo-Gothic style building for Masonry was unique at the time because most Masonic buildings being built in the 1920s were either a Greek revival or an Egyptian style. But the architect decided that Neo-Gothic was really the best option and showed the best face for American Freemasonry. He wanted it to be unique. The building is 17 stories tall. We will see a lot of those today. The design in this room is a reflection of the design of the exterior of the building, so it's kind of a Gothic look. Gothic architecture is one that brings in elements of nature. So we have tall arches. You'll see the archways over the elevator shafts, over the doorways. These are all elements of Gothic architecture. These are intended to look like two trees coming together to form a pinnacle. The design of this particular space is after the drawing room in a castle in Italy, which was visited by both Corrado Parducci and George D. Mason. It's not an exact replica, but that was the design inspiration for it. If everybody takes a look up at the painted ceiling there above us, you'll note that it is covered with lots of intricate detail. It's all hand painted, and all of those symbols have some sort of Masonic significance. Take a look at the top of our primary arch, and you look at the carving right directly at the top there. You will see the face of a man with some leaves and vines kind of coming out of his face. This is a Gothic element that we like to call the green man. The green man is commonly found in Gothic architecture. You'll find him in Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe. And he's intended to be a woodland spirit that is a protector of the building. I'd like to draw your attention now to the chandelier here in the middle. This chandelier, although it's difficult to see from this side, but if you look at the very top of the chandelier, you will see a carving of King Solomon. King Solomon is a very important figure in the Masonic allegories that happened during the degrees, and he is represented throughout the building as well. The light fixtures were designed by Corrado Parducci, but they were actually created by the Sterling Bronze Company out of Ithaca, New York.
This brass medallion is one of two designed by Corrado Parducci. The other is in the Fisher Building. You may have seen it. It's a representation of the Roman god Mercury. This one is more detailed and more specific to this building. There's one larger circle on the outside. The Latin words are the top, you have Christos, charity. Then the other one here is veritas, truth. Then you also have over here fortudo, fortitude or strength. The smaller symbols, the one at the bottom here is what is known as a square and compasses. That is a symbol that is commonly found in many Masonic temples throughout the world. The square is basically meant to kind of keep Masons within due bounds with themselves and when they're dealing with other people, specifically other Masons. The compasses have a similar function. The upper right is a representation of King Solomon's temple at Jerusalem. King Solomon is an important figure within Freemasonry, as Matt said. You will see representations of Solomon throughout this building. The other piece up top at the top left is a representation of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are written here in a more classical Hebrew, a more liturgical type Hebrew, so a more scholarly type Hebrew. And the other three figures here represented, the human forms, these have various meanings. They represent a life cycle. They represent many Masonic meanings: wisdom, strength, beauty. The one at the bottom right here, the younger man, this represents youth. It also represents beauty. The skull at the background shows that at this point in his life, he's not really thinking about his own mortality. He's thinking about the life in front of him, the life that he's yet to lead. The circular figure on the staff in front of him is a representation of a few different things. It's a representation of deity. It's a representation of the divine spark of the divine spirit within mankind. There's a biblical passage that says, "Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth." And this is roughly what that's meant to represent right there. The top figure is a representation of adulthood or wisdom. You see there's a book in front of the figure. That's a representation that during one's adult life you're expected to gather knowledge and practical wisdom and apply it to your everyday life and improve not only your own life but the lives of those around you. Raising children is seen as, or at least represented here, as a sign of maturity. It's also a way of establishing a future legacy. And the figure at the bottom here is a representation of older age or strength. You will notice that in his right arm he's holding a bundled rod of sticks. That is known as a fasces. The fasces is an older Roman symbol. It's a symbol of unity, it's a symbol of strength, it's a symbol of common purpose. What it represents is that one stick on its own is easily broken. Several sticks bundled together are much more difficult to break, and many sticks bundled tightly together are virtually impossible to break. The Masonic Temple here is full of symbolism. You'll often see many things represented in metaphors and allegories, and as we move about the building, we'll explain some of it too, to kind of give you an understanding and an appreciation behind that as well. At one point, this was the primary entrance and exit for the building. The parking lot did not exist until about the mid-1960s, so that was an old fire escape that they tore out and made a receiving entrance, and this entrance is used primarily for special events, concerts, things like that. If you look above the door right there, you have a Shakespearean reference, "To thine own self be true." And at one point, again, this was the primary way to get in and get out of the building, that was meant to leave you with a parting thought. And as I said, there's a lot of visual reminders throughout the building to remind Masons who they are and why they're here and why they're doing what they're doing. And that's another one right there to kind of give you that frame in mind, to give you that parting thought before you left the building.
We have these hand-carved frescoes. We have Veritas on this wall, and we have Fortitudo over here. Now, as Rob discussed, these are truth and fortitude. If you look at Fortitudo, you'll notice there's the bundle of sticks, the fasces there. Again, a symbol of unity and strength. And truth is a recurring theme throughout the building. We will see a lot of that as we go through the building. It's a very important element to Freemasonry. We want Masons to be honest and good men, and being true not only to yourself but to your fellow man is an important part of that. We are going to be utilizing our two original 1925 Otis manual elevators. We are heading to the 5th floor.
The building is divided roughly into three main parts. There's the ritual tower, which is the part of the building we're in right now. That contains the lodge rooms, the mezzanines, the lobby, the power areas up above the 7th floor. There's the middle part of the building, which contains the main theater as well as the drill hall space above that. Then there's the Eastern Tower, which was made for the Shrine Masonic Organization, which is currently vacant at this time. So just a few things about this area right here. If you look outside, you've got, unfortunately, we got a nice clear day. We have a very nice view of downtown Detroit. Most of the buildings you see in the foreground were either being built right around the same time this building was being built in the 1920s, or they came along a few years later. So on a clear day, from where we're standing, you could see all the way to Windsor from here. And there still are a few parts of the building where that's still the case. Now, the main reason why they chose this site for the Masonic Temple back in 1919 was the presence of Cass Park right out front. Cass Park is basically leased to the city of Detroit on the condition that it always be used as a park and nothing else. So the idea is that they never had to worry about buildings being built in front of the Masonic Temple here, primarily for aesthetic reasons, but also for security reasons as well. So also back in the 1920s, this particular area right around where we're around right here was known as Fraternity Row or Fraternity Corners, because in addition to the Masons, you also had several other fraternal organizations meeting nearby as well. You had the Knights of Pythias, which actually built the hotel next door for their purposes, the Hotel Fort Wayne. There was also the Knights of Columbus who met nearby. There was also the Odd Fellows who met nearby. There was the Order of Red Men, the Woodmen, various other smaller fraternal organizations. The Moose Lodge was down the street on Cass Avenue, and that's still there. So fraternalism was a more central concept in American male life from about the late 19th century up until about the Depression. Then it picked up a little bit again in the 1950s, and it kind of waned a little bit as well. So oftentimes, if a man was a Mason, he was also a member of some of these other fraternal organizations as well. So that's why it kind of made sense. You could walk between one or the other.
You may notice the decorative tiles in the floor, and these tiles are actually a little bit unique. These are what's called a flint fance tile. The flint fance tile company was similar to some of the other decorative tile companies in the day, but it was extremely short-lived. The owner of Champion Spark Plugs at the time understood that it cost less money for him to keep his kilns going 24 hours a day, even though he didn't have 24-hour production. And so the Flint Fance Tile Company was born. Now, as production ramped up on vehicles and the necessary spark plugs, the tile company was short-lived. It was only around for maybe a half a dozen or a dozen years before it disappeared. These tiles are installed in various locations in important buildings throughout the country and actually throughout the world. And we're happy to have some here as an example of this. This is one of the largest lodge rooms in the building. It seats about 250 people. And this is typical of what a Masonic lodge room looks like pretty much anywhere in the world. I say typical because it's got the same layout. Obviously, you look around, this room's probably decorated a little bit fancier than most lodge rooms around the world. But they wanted to make sure that their meeting space was significant and important. So some things about Freemasonry. A Masonic lodge is generally laid out, at least symbolically, from east to west, with the primary officer, that being the worshipful master of the lodge. We use the term worshipful not because we worship him, but because it's an Old English term of respect. He would sit in the east. The senior warden, or the second in command, would sit in the west. The junior warden, or the third in command, in the south. And you'll see other stations throughout the lodge for some other secondary officers. We've got desks, obviously, for the secretary and treasurer and things like that. All lodges have a lot of the elements that we'll see here. So in a Masonic lodge room, generally in the center, there will be an altar. On the altar during a meeting will be a volume of sacred law. That could be a Holy Bible, it could be a Quran, it could be the Torah, it could be any sacred holy book that's significant to the members of that particular lodge. It can even be multiple books if the membership is varied in their belief. We talk a little bit about belief. Freemasonry requires a belief in a supreme being. We don't dictate, however, what that is. So as long as you believe in a supreme being and are of the lawful age in this particular jurisdiction, that happens to be 18. That varies between 18 and 21 throughout the world. And in this particular jurisdiction, you do have to be a man to be a Mason, although we do have some auxiliary organizations that the ladies belong to. And female Freemasons do exist. They have their own independent organization that is very much like the one that meets in this room, but they decided that they wanted to kind of be on their own as opposed to integrate. They felt more comfortable, and Freemasonry has been an all-male organization primarily since the beginning. Around the altar, you'll see 3 lights or 3 candles. They will always be there, sometimes around the altar, sometimes at the 3 principal officers' locations, but they're always in the form of a triangle. And they represent the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge. You'll note that there are varying number of steps going up to the officer stations. Again, these are representative of the life cycle: youth, manhood, and old age. In this particular lodge room, we're fortunate to have a flight of winding stairs. Now, these are usually represented symbolically in a lodge room if it doesn't have a second floor, but this one happens to have one. They are there, and they are a flight of winding stairs consisting of 3, 5, and 7 steps. The number 3, 5, and 7 are all significant to Freemasons. The number 3 represents the 3 principal officers and the 3 stages of human life: youth, manhood, and age. The 5 is symbolic of the 5 orders of architecture, which are the Tuscan, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, and the Composite. The curled volutes at the top, and the design is said to have been taken after that of an agreeable woman dressed in her hair. In every lodge room, there is also 2 pillars, generally, or columns in the back of the room, generally in the west. These are representative of the pillars that stood at the porch to King Solomon's temple. They are topped with 2 globes. One is a celestial globe with the positions of the various stars and constellations and planets on it. The other, a terrestrial globe. You probably recognize those. We all saw them in grade school, right? Well, maybe not anymore, right? But probably looking at pictures of them now. But we all had a globe in school, right? It had what the Earth looked like, the various oceans and countries and continents. In the east, you'll see a couple of other symbols. We have these 2 stones here. One is called a rough ashlar, and the other a perfect ashlar. The rough ashlar is intended to represent a man in his rude and imperfect state, and the perfect ashlar, the state of perfection that we hope to achieve. So Freemasonry gives its members symbolic tools of a stone mason. So we use the square, the level, the plumb, and we're taught to apply these to ourselves to make ourselves a better person every day. So we're trying to break off all of the roughness of our human nature and become a better person. And that's really the entire purpose of a Masonic lodge, is to help its members chisel off the rough parts of their nature and become a better person. So the letter G is represented in every Masonic lodge as well. In the United States, you'll find it generally in the east, hanging over the master's chair. In other parts of the world, it may be suspended from the ceiling in the center of the room. But it has 2 meanings. One is geometry, obviously an important tool, an important art for Masons, and the other is deity. It's a representative of deity.
Masons are taught to kind of see certain symbols in certain ways, as Matt was saying, kind of a constant reminder of why we're doing what we're doing, and you'll see that throughout the lodge rooms. You'll see that throughout the building as well. So pretty much any lodge room throughout North America, or excuse me, at least the United States, is going to have the same basic layout. Matt described the way that's laid out and why it's laid out the way it is. But within the Detroit Masonic Temple, there is going to be a significant difference the way the rooms are designed. Each one is going to have its own architectural flair, something that kind of makes it unique, something that kind of makes it stand out in its own right. This room is called the Greek Ionic Room. Ionic because if you look at the top columns right there, the volute, that curvature up there, that is the Ionic architectural style, and that was referencing the 5 classical forms of architecture. 3 out of the 5 of them that are most important to Freemasonry, the Ionic, the Doric, and the Corinthian, are represented here at the temple. Greek, because this room is designed after the Temple of Diana at Ephesus in ancient Greece. So it's not an exact replica, but that was the inspiration behind it. So if you look at the ceiling right here, the grid pattern, the ornamentation around each individual square on the grid, the floral pattern, the colors of the paint used, even the way the vents are designed, all of this is designed to be inspired by that classical Greek design of that time. In fact, Corrado Parducci, to put himself in the frame of mind when he was designing the rooms, what he would do is he would literally cloister himself off for sometimes several days, sometimes up to a week or so, and he would literally immerse himself in the art and the music and the language and the culture of that particular time period so it really bring out his creativity in a visual sense. So a room like this, like he would close himself off for at least a few days and read Greek philosophy, eat Greek food, listen to the Greek music of the time, and just really kind of put himself in that time reference. And these are the results. So now the rooms themselves are by and large the same as they looked in 1926. The carpet's been updated several times. The benches, which were custom designed by the Henderson Ames Company for this building out of Kalamazoo, they were reupholstered back in the 1970s. Light bulbs, over the course of 90-some years, we've had to change some lights here and there. Some of the painting was touched up in the 1960s, but by and large, the rooms still look the same as they did in 1926 when the building was first opened. And we try to keep that original look and feel throughout the building whenever possible and whenever practical as well. Now, originally, there were 50 Masonic organizations that met at the Detroit Masonic Temple. At the time, there were over 50,000 Masons in the city of Detroit, so they would have had plenty of use for it. We currently have 11. 6 of them are what we refer to as Blue Lodges. That's kind of the main building block of Freemasonry. Every Mason is a member of a lodge. All right, here we are at the Doric Lodge Room. Now again, because as Matt was referencing, there are 5 classical orders of architecture. 3 of them, the Ionic, which we just saw, the Doric, where we're here now, and the Corinthian, which we'll see next, are represented in this building right here. Now the Doric architectural style, and if you look in the columns right here in the east, that's the Doric architectural style. The Doric is a bit more plain. It doesn't have a lot of ornamentation to it. It's classically, it's designed after a strong, robust man. So the Ionic has a bit more decoration to it. So consequently, as the Doric is a bit more plain, a bit more unadorned, the Doric room itself here is a bit more stripped down, a bit more austere, as you can see. Not quite as detailed as the room we were just in. It's a bit smaller, but it's still a nice-looking lodge room in its own right. Sometimes simplicity is the best form of beauty. So this room right here was designed after the Temple of Apollo. So again, it's not an exact replica. That was what it was inspired by. And if you look around, there's a few elements from that temple. The ceiling, on the posts, you still have that classical Greek ornamentation, those squiggly lines right there. Then you have sunbursts right here. Sunbursts were something that was commonly associated with later period Greek design, almost into where it gets to point to a Roman period. That's something you found at that temple. The ornamentation around either warden stations in the south or the west has things that are directly incorporated from that building. You've got 2 columns. On top of the columns are the entablature, and you have representations of serpents. Serpents were a symbol of eternal wisdom. Apollo's consort, Hygieia, her symbol was the snake. Hygieia was also the goddess associated with hygiene, Hygieia, hygiene, and health. The half moon and stars was a symbol of secrecy. Within a Masonic context, it's also a symbol of astronomy. Matt mentioned geometry was one of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. There's a total of 7. There's rhetoric, grammar, logic, music, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. So that's a representation of it there. And the 3 figures at the top right there, now it's a little bit difficult to see in this light. That is a literal representation of the transformative process of initiation, the transformative properties of ritual. You literally see a man stepping out of his shell. He is forging a new path in his life. He is leaving kind of his old self behind and forming a new sense of purpose, a new identity, so to speak. And that's a representation of the power of Masonry, what it can do for one's life. And that's a visual representation of that.
In the lodge rooms, you will see that there's these doors. They're not in every lodge room, but they happen to be in the 2 that we were just in. And this is actually a prop that's used during the process of initiation. When a Masons meet in a lodge, we want to make sure that a lodge is intended to be a place of refuge, so we shut out the outside world. If we close these doors, these rooms are almost deathly quiet. They're designed that way specifically. The walls between here and the lodge room next door, there's 3 foot of wall and 6 foot of hallway between the rooms, okay? So we want it to be, you should be able to shut out the outside world and really kind of be at peace and be able to meditate and be at one with yourself. So when we do that, and we're going through our process of initiation, of course, we don't want to open the doors and close the doors and grab the props that we need. So we build areas inside the room to make sure that we have a little storage space for the little things that we need for the initiation process, as opposed to having the doors open and close and slam and kind of messing up that whole feel. So this actually is one of those props that's used for the initiation. It's used during the Master Mason degree, or the 3rd part of the initiation. The first is the Entered Apprentice degree. The 2nd part is the Fellowcraft degree, and the 3rd part is the Master Mason degree. And in between each degree, the candidate or the brother is asked to learn and then recite a little bit about what he learned, so that we make sure that he has received the information and he's actually going to be able to take those tools that we gave him and apply them to his life.
We are currently on the 4th floor of the temple. We have the cornerstone from the first Detroit Masonic Temple here. That was built at the corner of 1st and Lafayette downtown. The cornerstone was laid in January of 1894. The building was completed approximately 1 year later. Prior to that, Masonic lodges and groups would typically meet in hotels or taverns or whatnot. They designed it for 50 years of use. However, Freemasonry Detroit was growing so fast at the time, it ran out of room in just 12 years. So there were some internal deliberations about what to do, whether to expand that building or whether to build an entirely new building. So finally, in 1916, the decision was made to just build a brand new building to accommodate not only the membership in Detroit at that time, but also to accommodate for future growth. So finally, in 1919, they acquired all the land on this parcel right here. They broke ground Thanksgiving Day 1920. The cornerstone was laid September 18th, 1922. That was the same date in 1793 that George Washington laid the cornerstone for the U.S. Capitol building. So that's why they chose that date in particular. In fact, some of the items that were used in that ceremony, the apron, the trowel, the level, were used in this one as well. Finally, Thanksgiving Day 1926, the building officially opened. So start to finish, it was a 6-year construction. The original building survived for a few years into the 1930s as the Cadillac Athletic Club. However, during the Depression, it just couldn't compete with the various other private clubs in the city, and it closed. The Grand Lodge of Michigan, after it closed, was paying in 1930s dollars $50,000 a month for a building with very limited prospects. So the difficult decision was made to sell the building. The building was sold. January 1936, the building was demolished. If you're familiar with downtown Detroit, it's where the Comerica Bank building is, across the street from the Fort Shelby Hotel. That's where it once was. However, they saved the cornerstone. They brought the cornerstone here. They had a ceremony. When it was here, they took out a time capsule that contained several items that were in the stone, newspaper articles, letters, various Masonic items, displayed them. The stone itself was quarried in Missouri. It's red granite. It weighs just over 1.5 tons. It's not going anywhere. It's pretty heavy. I don't think anyone's going to try to move it. Also, too, these chairs right here are from the original Masonic Temple as well. So these are 150 years old, give or take. And the wood in the west wall of the lodge room that we're about to see is from that original building as well.
So we're now in the Corinthian lodge room. If you haven't figured it out by now, the lodge rooms are named based on the column style that is in the lodge room. So these columns are Corinthian columns. They were, as you can see, they're generally a little bit narrower than some of the other columns, and that's why they're a lot of times placed in pairs like we see them here. The Corinthian column, the style was said to have been invented by Callimachus at Corinth, following his observation of a particular unusual thing. So passing the grave of a young woman, he observed a basket of her toys placed near her grave, and it happened to have been placed on an acanthus root. And a tile was placed over the top of the basket to protect the things inside. And the acanthus root, as it grew up around the basket, the leaves encompassed the basket, and then when they met with the tile, they met an obstruction and started to bend downward. So the capital of the Corinthian column, you'll note the bending leaves. The volutes are intended to look like the bending leaves of the acanthus root bending back down. The very top, the tile, and we have all of this decoration. So this is one of the most ornate column styles that there is, and you'll note that the room is the most ornate room that we've been in yet. The designs were intended to match the style of architecture chosen for the space. I'm going to point out just a couple of things, and then I'm going to let Rob cover a lot. But I want to talk about the words along the outside of the walls here. So you'll note that we have some scripture on both walls. On this wall, it says, "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." That's one of the first phrases that a Mason hears when he's first initiated into Freemasonry. And on this wall, we have, "Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it." That is a phrase that is commonly used at a Masonic funeral. So we have a representation of the beginning and the end of a Masonic career or a Masonic life. We often get asked about Freemasonry and whether it's a religion. Freemasonry is not a religion. It is, however, spiritual. And you may have gotten that from some of what I've been saying and Rob has been saying as we've gone through some of the rooms. We require a belief in deity. An atheist cannot be a Mason. But we don't define who that deity is or how you worship your deity. But there's a lot of confusion because we do use some scripture readings. These are all intended to be allegorical, to teach the story along as opposed to the actual verbiage. It's to teach the moral of the story or the the lesson intended to be learned. I will let Rob continue with the room, but I will mention that the green man, yeah, he's in here.
Now, as Matt mentioned, the Corinthian architectural style is a bit more detailed about all the other classical orders of architecture, so particularly the ceiling. Now, this room itself was modeled after the Temple of Aphrodite, and again, not an exact replica, but that's what it was inspired by. So you see a lot of the design elements from here. The Temple of Aphrodite had a lot of gilded work on the ceiling, more feminine touches. So consequently, the ceiling has a bit more. And keep in mind, this is all done by hand. This is all hand carved, all hand painted. Corrado Parducci had roughly 300 skilled artisans working under his supervision. So a room like this, you would have at least 30 to 40 workers in here at all times doing some of the fine point work, doing some of the more broad-based carving, doing the painting. Everybody had a job to do. And this room, by and large, same thing. It's it's still roughly the same as it was in 1926, with a few slight details actually. The lesser lights around the altar were actually made by a member of the lodge back in 1949 to actually kind of match the overall look and feel of the lodge room. They're still in use today. And the pillars in the west there are from a Masonic temple in Macomb County that closed recently, and rather than just stick them in a closet somewhere where they'd be forgotten, they were actually brought down here and asked if we wouldn't mind incorporating them in a lodge room or some sort of a context in here, and that's what we did, just to keep them within the fraternity. But everything else you see here, by and large, is still from 1926, and while we're all looking in that direction, that is the wood I was telling you about earlier. That is the wood from the original Detroit Masonic Temple. That is 1894 mahogany we're all looking at. What had happened is during the design phase of this building, they realized that obviously that building they were in was not going to be a Masonic temple for much longer, but they wanted to incorporate a few of those details into the new building. So they laid the dimensions for this room out perfectly so that it would match up exactly with one of the walls and one of the lodge rooms in the early Masonic temple. Then they very carefully deassembled the wood in that wall, then very carefully transported it here and meticulously put it together here piece by piece. So if you look closely, you can still see some of the seams from when it was originally put apart and then carefully put back together. And by and large, it is held up very well. There's a few bumps and scrapes here and there, but it still looks roughly the same as it did. The dry air in the lodge rooms, the lack of natural light, and the building does get pretty warm in the summer, but not overwhelmingly hot or humid to the point where it's going to warp wood or somehow discolor it in any way. So that is from the original Masonic Temple, and it's not too often you see mahogany in that kind of a scale, so it's definitely a nice touch. The chandeliers we see are from, these are also made by the Sterling Bronze Company. These were made out of marble. Now originally they designed the lights here to kind of point downwards, but as they were assembling it they realized structurally that just wasn't going to be good enough to kind of support it properly, so they made the lights into a crown. Sometimes on tours we get asked why the lights are so dirty. No, it's marble. It looks that way. So another touch too is that in the corner right here, then originally there was some water damage right above that word "how" right there. Several years ago during a bad winter we had a pipe burst on the 5th floor mezzanine. It happened overnight and it trickled downwards, so unfortunately it caused some damage on some of the walls, like leading downwards, and many of those dentils and brackets were just heavily damaged. It was unsightly for several years, but recently, beginning early last year, the temple embarked on a large-scale restoration effort, both the exterior and the interior. So several of the lodge rooms have, there were certain parts of it where paint was flecking, or in this instance, like I said, there was some damage to the ceiling. So what they actually did is that they removed several of those damaged dentils and brackets. Some plaster restoration specialists actually took molds of some of the existing dentils and brackets here, hand carved them, put them in place, and then some paint restoration specialists went to work. So unless you're looking very closely, you'd be very hard pressed to tell the difference between the restored pieces and the originals. So that was one part right there that was restored recently as well. Take a look at the walls on the north and south. You see what appear to be medallions, and many of them are. But a building this size obviously needs a good ventilation system, and whenever possible, they didn't want it to detract from the overall design of whatever room they were in, so when they could, they incorporated it into the design themselves. So you see a medallion here, then you've got a vent, and then a medallion, and so on and so forth.
There's a couple things I wanted to point out in this room. We talked about the Masonic initiation and that whole process. Well, a lot of times when we're on these tours, we get asked about this little trapdoor. So we jokingly say that we're going to reveal the secrets of Masonry. And essentially what happens is the initiation process happens, the candidate comes in, goes through the process. Well, following that, we have a lecture. And we explain what the candidate went through to them, because they go through a portion of it blindfolded. So we explain that to them and explain the symbolism and why and all of the things that happen. Well, in the 1800s, when they built the original Masonic Temple, they built state-of-the-art, right? So we had state-of-the-art 1896 PowerPoint, if you will, which was a device called a magic lantern. And the magic lantern was a slide projector with about a 6,000 watt bulb in it, it felt like, that you would hand feed hand-painted glass slides into to display them on the screen. And you may have noticed that there's a screen that comes down from the ceiling. Well, so as not to detract from the aesthetics of the room, they would hide the projector behind the wall. Now it's just plaster flaking. We don't actually utilize the projector anymore. We do actually use PowerPoint. But there's another unique thing about the building, and that is that at the time that it was built, there was this argument happening between a couple of major players in the electrical business, and that was, should we have AC or should we have DC power? Thomas Edison and Westinghouse were big proponents of DC power. Thomas Edison happened also to be a Mason, and so the building was built with direct current power and later converted to AC power. Now, when we do a Masonic initiation, we want to make sure that sometimes we have to bring the lights down, and DC power gives us some really good flexibility from a 1926 perspective. So let's say we needed to bring the lights down, and we have almost 100% control over how much power we feed into the circuit as to how much light we get in the room. So we installed these state-of-the-art 1926 dimmer switches that look something like steering a submarine. But we joke about the technology today because obviously it seems really antiquated, but when you think in terms of when the building was created, the design and the architecture and all of the elements that they included were really state-of-the-art for the day. So in the United States specifically, we chose a rule, if you will, that the master of the lodge wears a hat. In the 1920s, of course, it was common to come to lodge in white tie and tails because it was a formal event, it was a special event, and so the master would very commonly wear a top hat. Masters in Michigan are not required to wear a top hat per se. Our rule book actually tells them to wear a hat that is consistent with what they're wearing otherwise. Some lodges, as Rob said, were more casual, some more formal. But in Texas, you see a lot of cowboy hats. In Massachusetts, they actually wear tri-corner hats. So there's a wide variety of hats worn by worshipful masters throughout the United States. It is a convention that's almost exclusive to the United States, however. Masters in other countries generally don't wear a hat.
Okay, folks, we are now on the 3rd floor of the temple. This entire area right here has more of a medieval theme to it. That is directly correlated, and the group we're about to see more in just a few minutes. This is directly inspired by the time of the knights, the time of the chivalric orders. This entire area of the building we're about to see just past these doors is devoted towards a group known as the Commandery. Their full name is Detroit Commandery No. 1 Knights Templar. Now, Commandery, now once a man becomes a Master Mason, you might have heard of things like the 33rd degree or something like that. There's really nothing higher than a Master Mason. Everything above that is either optional or honorary. However, if he chooses to do so, he doesn't have to, but there are other what we refer to as appendant bodies within Freemasonry. There are certain side groups that a Master Mason can join if he so desires. There are several main branches, one of them referred to as the Scottish Rite. We'll talk a little bit more about the Scottish Rite in the lobby downstairs towards the end of the tour. But the Scottish Rite was originally in this building. They moved to Dearborn back in 2006. They do 29 different degrees within their grouping. The York Rite is the second main branch. They're kind of like a confederation of 3 main groups. There's the chapter, the council, and the commandery. There's also the shrine, which originally met in this building as well. Those are the 3 main ones. The commandery does things a little bit unique within Freemasonry. For one thing, they have a specific religious orientation to it. Now, as Matt mentioned, as long as a man believes in some sort of a supreme being, typically doesn't matter which one, that's one of the main requirements for Freemasonry. We're by and large a non-sectarian organization. Spirituality is important, but we're really not meant to compete with or supplant religious faith. It's meant to complement it. Commandery, because they claim to carry on, they don't claim direct descent from the Knights Templar, but they claim to carry out the heritage and the values that the Knights Templar fought for. So there is a requirement that you believe in a Trinitarian form of Christianity. So there is that element right there, and as we go into the Commandery Asylum, you'll see a lot more Christian iconography, a lot more Christian symbolism, things like that. Another thing too is that the Commandery often they do have a uniform. It's based off an old Civil War parade dress uniform. There is a frock coat. There's a more modern equivalent, it's more like a suit and tie. They wear a certain hat, which is known as a chapeau. It's based off an old French parade dress uniform, so they have that as well. They carry swords. They do paramilitary style dress tactics as well. So there's quite a few significant differences in Commandery. So this entire area was built just for them. So just wanted to issue a few of those disclaimers, just so you knew that going in. The chandelier right here is also, just like everything else, is sterling bronze. The 2 knights, actually they're kind of later period successors of the knights. Those are chevaliers. So those are more of like 16th, 17th century French successors to the original knights right here. And if you look around too, you'll see various shields, various symbols of heraldry right here. Just a couple of them right here. You'll see a lot of roses right here. Now, there were various different forms of chivalric orders, but by and large, they were Catholic for the most part. That shows that they were bound to Mary. The other things right here by the elevators, now these are just a few things that Corrado Parducci felt were kind of important to kind of put this overall lobby together. So these are kind of decorative details. You have the belladonna flowers, and you have the hunting hounds right here. So these are kind of details that Parducci felt were important to incorporate for the lobby. So this is the Commandery parlor. This is typically where the members of the commandery would get ready before and after their meetings. They have a clubhouse in the back where they do that now. So this room is still used for that, but it's also used for more public usages as well. Many corporate luncheons and seminars and whatnot are typically held in this room right here. Now, this room itself was renovated about 3 years ago. The paint and the plaster was all redone. These tapestries, which were from the original Detroit Masonic Temple, were taken out and cleaned, put back together. And another touch was this floor right here. Now, we had to replace the carpet in this area as well. We had to replace the stuff over the concrete. We were tearing this up. We had a nice surprise. We had a maple wood floor. Back in the 1920s, carpet was a status symbol. If you had a wood floor, it typically showed that you were either too cheap or too poor to afford carpet, and that's a stigma they wanted to avoid in this building. So they just put carpet on everything. But when they were tearing it up, they said, well, why not? It's not too often you get a maple wood floor. So they sanded and stained it, and here we have it. And it's really added to the versatility of the room. It's really complemented it. So again, this room is used primarily for more public functions now.
So this room is known as the Commandery Asylum. Asylum is an ancient Latin term that means place of refuge. As you can see, its design is unique from all of the other rooms in the temple. It is intended to have a medieval theme or a castle look, classic Gothic castle. Architecturally, I want you to understand what you're seeing. Normally, a room this size is on the ground floor of a building. You don't build a 4.5-story high room in the middle of the building. And we are quite literally in the middle of the building. That cross was designed to be essentially in the center of the building, symbolically to remind Masons that their faith should be at the center of their lives. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the room, the floor, this is the 3rd floor, 6 stories off the street. The ceiling extends beyond the 4th floor mezzanine. The room is obviously very popular for weddings, right? It's our most popular room for weddings. Anybody who's ever had the opportunity to see a ceremony here can tell why. The other thing that you might notice about the room is that acoustically, I'm not yelling at you, and I can be heard pretty clearly. The acoustics in the building were designed at a time before amplified sound. So you can stand and speak at a normal tone and be heard throughout the building. I'm going to let Rob talk about some of the design details and our organ.
So you see what appear to be stained glass windows right here. Technically, they're not, in the strictest sense, they're not visible completely from the outside. So the rules for putting them on the stained glass registry are pretty strict. So technically they're not that way, but they were designed by the Detroit Art Glass Company. That was the same company back in the early 20th century that designed many of the stained glass windows in many cathedrals in the Metro Detroit area. Some of them are not too far from here. So those were put in 1925. They tell a story in many sense. Now, before I should go into it, just want to let you know you're seeing them in their original glory right here. For many years, they had some blackout curtains over them that kind of obscured the complete view. Many of the electric panel board behind it didn't quite work completely all the way, but early last year that was restored, and now we see them, and it's really something to see. Now, they tell a story. Now again, the commandery bases its kind of its focus off the historical Knights Templar. Again, they don't claim direct descendant. There are a few things here that from that thing that kind of correlate with that. And for instance, the banners right here, Each one of them is designed after a coat of arms of one of the historic Grand Masters of the Knights Templar. The cross with the crown, that is one of the symbols of the historic Knights Templar as well. You'll often see something in here called In Hoc Signo Vinces, the Latin, which means in this sign you will conquer. So there's some of those as well. But that's designed to kind of be a reference to Templar history. The figure on the left is known as a pilgrim warrior. Basically at this point, he's a Knight Templar aspirant. He's training to become a full-fledged Knight. He's undergoing a period where he's undergoing simultaneous religious and military training. The Knights Templar originally were formed to guard pilgrims on the way to Jerusalem. So they were very, they got a lot of their theology from the Cistercian order. So they kind of based it off that, but they were also very, very highly trained soldiers. So kind of a duality right there. The center figure, that's Christ. The red is emblematic of his humanity, the blue of his divinity. The people at his feet are St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. Again, that's kind of keeping with the duality there too. Those are two important figures within Freemasonry. One represents strength, one represents beauty, one represents winter, one represents summer, so on and so forth. And the figure on the right is a man known as a mendicant. He's somewhat like a monk. He's someone who's dedicated himself to a spiritual path. So as you can see, you got the warrior type on the left, the more spiritual type on the right. Again, that's more of a duality right there. He's wearing a plain brown cloak, he's carrying a plain staff, he's wearing a plain red cap, and he's reading, which may not seem like much, but at that time it would have been interesting because most people at that time who could read were primarily royalty, nobility, clergy, some merchants, and knights. Now, long story short, the Knights Templar, they were founded in 1187, and they roughly till about 1307. During that time, they amassed quite a bit of financial holdings. Typically what they would do is kind of a forerunner to the modern banking system. They would issue the forerunners of checks, they were letters of marque. They would hold on to your money for you in exchange for some interest, and then you could take that letter into another Templar area and they would actually cash it for you. Also, they acquired quite a bit of property throughout, especially southern France. Finally, towards the late 1290s, early 1300s, roughly after the Battle of Acre in 1291, the Crusades had officially ended. The Crusaders, what were left of them, were moving back to Europe, which included the Templars. And they acquired quite a bit of land in southern France. Also, they would often loan the kings of Europe quite a bit of money for their wars. There was one king in particular named Philip the Fair, or Philip the Bell, who owed the Templars quite a bit of money. He was also concerned that they were going to try to set up a independent Templar kingdom in southern France. So he had a twofold purpose. He was very concerned about the Templars. He didn't want them around anymore. So this was also the time of the Babylonian captivity. So you had a pope in Rome, and you also had a pope in Avignon in southern France. Now the popes in Avignon were basically set up by the French kings. He went to the pope in Avignon, Clement V, and said, I want the Templars declared as heretics. So they did that. So Friday the 13th, October the 13th, 1307, the king's soldiers unleashed secret orders that basically said, round up the Templars, imprison them, kill them if you have to. So many of them were imprisoned for many years into confessing false confessions of heresy, of treason, but some of them did escape. So what that's meant to represent is that the Templars who survived were carrying out their knightly oaths. They were carrying out their obligations, even though they had to do it in secret now. So that's more symbolism. It means always stay true to a trust, even if sometimes it's not convenient, and even if there's sometimes where you kind of have to hide it from the modern world. So and there's some Latin inscriptions above, two of them right here. The inscription above the knight on the left is Semper Fidelis. Does it sound familiar? There you go, Marine Corps. The Marines adopted it. The Templars had it first. The I forget what the Latin says on the right, but translated to English it means esteem is the reward of virtue. So it basically means lead a virtuous life. You will be rewarded, if not in this life, then certainly the next. So there's a spiritual connotation to that. Behind the curtain is a pit which leads down to and it leads out to a stage system. There's 2 mirrors on a 45-degree angle, which has a kind of a biblical stage show. This room is purpose-built for the commandery orders. There are parts of that which contain scenes from the New Testament. So the candidate is led around and shows figures from that as well. So that's what that is behind there. The organ is one of 3 in the building. 2 of them are operational. There's a non-operating pipe organ in the large lodge room and 5th floor we were in. There's this one right here, which is in Austin. It has about 700 pipes. So it's a good sound, you can hear it pretty well. The one in the Jack White Theater is the Skinner organ. That one has 4,300 pipes to it. So 2 out of 3 pipe organs work in the building. Another thing too, if you look at the floor, if you look right in the right light, you'll see a series of like black lines or grooves in the floor. That was done deliberately. The idea behind that is that when knights in first it would be like chainmail, and later on it'd be actual suits of armor would actually march in and do their drill tactics. They would actually leave cuts in the floor. And also the floor has like a rough shot appearance. The idea behind that is that the metal would actually grind down the stone, so it wouldn't really shine. It would be a worn look and feel to it. So we are currently in a room which is known as the Prelate's apartment. The Prelate, P-R-E-L-A-T-E, is sort of like the chaplain of the commandery. But because the commandery has more of a spiritual focus, the prelate typically has more of an enhanced role within the commandery. Now, the prelate, unlike a lodge where it's usually the worshipful master that will give the obligation at the altar, in commandery it's the prelate that does that. He sits right there and he comes down and he gives the oaths and obligations right here. Now, historically, the prelate within the Templars would typically have like his own side area within wherever the Templars met, like a literal apartment. So this is kind of meant to represent that. Now, this room here is one of 2 in the building with a Romanesque architectural style. So with the exception of the pillars by the door and the pillars by the chair here, as you can see, everything in here is rounded. And now that has a twofold purpose. Rooms like this, you would often have private conversations, sometimes confessions, things like that. So they didn't want people to be able to hide and eavesdrop, so they kind of eliminated the hiding places around here. And also because this room has a specific spiritual focus to it, it kind of shows that nothing is hidden from the eyes of God. So it's more of a symbolism there. And Romanesque architecture was very popular in Western Europe from about 1050 roughly to about 1300 AD. It coincided primarily with the height of the power and influence of the various chivalric orders. So you didn't just have the Templars, you had the Knights of Malta, you had the Knights Hospitaller, you had the Sovereign Order of Christ, the Teutonic Order, and many others. So that it's kind of an ode to that particular time period. So if you look along the wall, like on either side, here and there, you will see various Byzantine-style crosses. You'll see some Byzantine-style lattice work in between the crosses. And just to make sure that it's really stood out, they actually put a coat of lacquer over this. If you look closely, you can still see the brushstrokes on it. This room, same as the others, with the exception of the carpet and the lighting, everything is still original to 1926. That says, Magna est Veritas, great is truth. So that's something over there right there. And Corrado Parducci was a real fan of this room. He really liked this, so he really wanted to incorporate a few details in this room specifically. One of them, directly behind the prelate's chair right there, is marble from his hometown. Parducci was born in a town called Buta, B-U-T-A. It's about 10 miles outside of Pisa. He came to New York as a small boy, and then later on in his 20s moved to Detroit. He was only going to be in Detroit for about 6 months to work on some bank buildings on Griswold, but he ended up staying most of his life. But he never forgot his roots. And because he really had an affinity for this room, he brought in that marble from his hometown. And it's the only instance where you're going to see that specific kind of marble outside of that particular area in Italy. So that's a really nice touch. The carvings in here, you've got gargoyles in the inset pillars right here. That's because this room kind of takes on an enhanced spiritual role, they wanted to keep the spiritual bad stuff out. So that's another homage to classical Gothic architecture. And the pillars right here, these are kind of instances that Parducci were kind of felt it was important to kind of put in here. You've got the urns, you've got kind of hybrid animals, elements you would find in a classical Gothic cathedral. The red cross on a white background is another Templar symbol. The face you see on this pillar right here is Saint Longinus. Saint Longinus was a Roman centurion who, according to legend, pierced Christ's side when he was on the cross, then subsequently converted to Christianity. If you sit in the prelate's seat, and if you look up a little bit, you will see something that only the prelate can see from this room. It's a privilege reserved just for him. So we are currently in the Jack White lobby, formerly known as the Scottish Rite lobby. As we were mentioning upstairs on the 3rd floor, the Scottish Rite was one of the appendant bodies within Freemasonry that originally met here. They no longer do. This entire area was actually exclusively for them at one point. This lobby was originally a lounge for them, so they had chairs and couches and chase lounges all surround here. Their offices were originally right around the corner here. It's the wedding coordinator's office now. They outgrew that relatively quickly, so at some point they had the entire 6th floor to themselves before they moved out. Like I said, there were 2 lodge rooms that originally were supposed to be there, which never got built, so they implemented them for their own purposes. Now, back in 2013, the rock musician Jack White helped the building out. Now, I should probably back up a bit before that. Jack White's mother moved here in the 1970s from Kansas City. She didn't know anyone here. She was having a hard time finding employment, so she got a job here as an usher. So she was with the building for many years. And later on, now basically what had happened was in 2013, the building kind of fell behind on its taxes a little bit. I mean, we would have and could have paid them, but Jack White found out about it, and unsolicited, he just showed up at the back door one day with a check and said, "Here, I want to help you." And he said, we told him, you don't have to do this, but he's like, no, I insist, I want to help. So, and that's how that came about. And he didn't ask for this, but it wouldn't have been long before word got out who did it. So we just couldn't let that just not go away unnoticed. So we renamed a few things in his honor. The Jack White lobby here, and in a few minutes we're going to see the Jack White Theater here. So there's a few touches here that are kind of unique. But also keeping in mind with the main lobby stuff. You still got the pomegranates, you still got the grapevines along the wall right here. As you can see, this is a little bit more darker. This is actually designed kind of similar to the 3rd floor. You've got more heraldry symbols on the ceiling right there. The 32nd degree in the Scottish Rite is set during a medieval time period. So that's kind of why they associated a lot of these elements with this elements as well. On top of the chandelier, you will see a double-headed eagle. That is the eagle of Lagash. Lagash was a city-state in ancient Sumeria, which was a source of learning, of knowledge, of culture. So they wanted to associate themselves with that. The eagle looking both east and both west shows the diffusion of knowledge from the east to the west. Also, that flag holder between the windows over there on that wall, that is a consistory cross. The Scottish Rite is made up of 4 concordant bodies and 1 umbrella organization. That is one of the symbols associated with that.
We do have a couple of portraits here, and these were both originally a little different. You might notice the smaller of the 2 of President Ulysses S. Grant. This is actually one of only 2 paintings that Grant ever posed for in uniform. The artist was Emanuel Lutz, famous German artist who painted this portrait. You might know Lutz if you've ever heard of the portrait of George Washington crossing the Delaware. Very, very famous painting that was unfortunately destroyed by fire. So you'll note the nice brass kind of display around it, and then you'll see George Washington. And you'll note the brass display around him doesn't quite fit. The reason for that is because that is not the original portrait that was there. That is a print. The original portrait is actually another Lutz painting. It was 10 foot in height. And it was actually a life-size portrait of George Washington in Masonic regalia. That painting was owned by the Scottish Rite Valley of Detroit. They still have ownership of that, but it is now on permanent loan to the Scottish Rite National Museum in Massachusetts. A print of it at full size hangs in the Scottish Rite's building in Dearborn, unfortunately in the stairwell, because it was the only wall that was tall enough to hold that particular portrait. So folks, this is the Jack White Theater, recently renamed, as Rob said, formerly the Scottish Rite Cathedral. It's just over 1,500 seats, and many plays, concerts, high school graduations, and whatnot have happened on this stage. It was purpose-built, however, for the Scottish Rite body. This was the group that Rob was talking about in the lobby. They have 29 different degrees that they put on. Each one of those is a play that is witnessed by the candidates and the members. So this stage was created, all of the rigging that you see off to the right there, those were all of the various backdrops. Those are the cables to lower the various backdrops that they had. And they're actually still numbered for the various degrees, but all of the backdrops have been relocated to their new facility.
Okay, that is the Skinner organ that we were mentioning upstairs. That is a W.B. Skinner organ that was installed in 1926. The Scottish Rite classes that were held in here between 1920 and 1927 raised the money to actually donate and pay for that. So you have to imagine that would have been upwards from about at least 2,000 men raising money to pay for that organ. There's only about 50 functioning Skinner organs left in North America. And they're very unique in the fact that if you open them up and there's a series of levers and gears and knobs and buttons that can play pretty much any musical sound you can think of. Notes, tones, octaves, name it. There's a total of 4,300 pipes. Some of them are only a few millimeters wide. Some of them are a few feet wide to kind of reflect the general. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller because they have to display different sounds and tones and whatnot. Some of the pipes go all the way up to the 4th floor. And this organ you can hear all throughout the building. So it's a very loud sound. It's very unique. We do have an in-house organist who comes in and plays it at least once a week, just to make sure it's in good working order, because most of the parts on it were custom made. Many of them were made by hand. So it's very important to keep that in good working order.
The ventilation system in the building is unique in that we've got a boiler system. Some 3 stories below the street level, there's actually a series of doors. 5 stories above street level, there's a series of open vents. By opening the doors, we draw the fresh air in. It's drawn over either a heated or chilled element, and then drawn throughout the building based on what doors are open and which doors are closed. There's entire floors that are dedicated to fans that pull the air, push the air through the building. So yes, this is part of, it's not really an air conditioner. We have kind of a chiller unit that the air draws across, and then and there's only a few areas that even have that. Most of the building is not air conditioned in any way.
Okay, this is the main theater, also known as the main auditorium. Unlike the Jack White Theater that we were just in, which was built primarily for fraternal use, the main auditorium here was built primarily for public use. 4,404 seats. The seats by the green floor in front of the stage here can be removed if needed, so we can get up to 5,000 people in here for events. This is the largest stage in Detroit, 55 by 118 feet. It's 82 feet up to the gridiron. Largest stage between here and Chicago, top 15 among the largest stages in the country. Originally, this was built in the Venetian Gothic style by George Mason. He wanted this theater to resemble an opera house from Paris. That's the overall look that he was going for. So the details you see throughout here are in the Venetian Gothic style. The overwhelming color red, the detail around the box seats, the gold ornamental paint, the angels, the way the seats kind of slope towards the corners, the way the ceiling and the chandeliers are designed. Those are all Venetian Gothic style elements. Now, he and Corrado Parducci had a bit of a dispute over what the theater should look like. Parducci, as you see throughout the tour, was a pretty big fan of ancient Greek design. He felt that a classical Greek amphitheater would have been the best design for the theater, both acoustically and aesthetically. Mason really wanted a Parisian opera house, so they tried to arbitrate it. So Mason was the architect. He won the debate, but the compromise would have been that the unfinished theater on the 7th floor would have been classical Greek architecture. Had that been completed, that would have been a 700-seat theater for Masons only. But that, along with several other details in the building, just never got completed. So now it's used primarily for storage. Now the chandeliers there, each one of them has 94 bulbs each. Those are theater lighting. The rectifiers run on direct current. So we've been updating lighting to LED throughout the building. Those are the ones that we could not do that because LEDs are not compatible with direct current. So we did something back in February of 2017 that we hadn't done since 1990. We lowered them. The bulbs had to be replaced. They had to be cleaned out and cleaned up. So above us, if you remember that room on the 3rd floor with the maplewood floor, down that hall, there's an access panel over each one of them. You open that up, and there's a hand crank that cranks them all down by hand. The one on the left took about 3 men taking turns on it because it hadn't been done in so long. They wanted to be very careful, very deliberative. That one took about an hour. The other one, once they got the gist of it, it took about 20 minutes. So they lowered them down about 1.5 feet off the floor. They changed all 94 bulbs in each of them, cleaned them up, and raised them back up. Took a week and a half from start to finish. So it was quite a sight to behold. Now, this was actually the site of the first event in the Masonic Temple, even prior to the building opening. Now, the building officially opened in Thanksgiving in 1926. February of that year, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra did a performance in here for George Washington's birthday. So that was the first official event. In fact, the DSO played here every Sunday night between 1936 and 1942. So one of many acts to play here. It was a pretty big Broadway theater up until about the mid-2000s. Phantom of the Opera, Cats, Miss Saigon had long runs here. In the early stages, vaudeville, big band stuff, orchestras. Then as musical tastes evolved, they went into Motown and rock and various other acts. So it's had quite a bit over the course of the years.
Yeah, you're actually standing just about the spot that Jimi Hendrix is standing in the photo that was taken from backstage here that shows him playing on this stage. So almost every significant act played here. Of the just over 200 musicians that have been, or acts I should say, that have been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, more than 100 have played this stage. Many of them before their prime and as opening acts. In fact, Queen's the first time Queen played this stage, they were opening for Mott the Hoople.
So there's 3 stories of dressing room stage left, 2 stories of dressing room stage right. The largest stage we have is the Stars dressing room, which was originally 2 dressing rooms. Back in 1958, the opera singer Maria Callas did a show here. her rider on her contract was that she had to have the biggest dressing room in the building. In fact, the dimensions were even specifically laid out, but we didn't have a dressing room that would fit that. So what they did is they had enough notice, they knocked it out and a wall between the two, and they actually made that a much larger dressing room. So to this day, that's referred to as the stage, the Stars dressing room. The counterweights you see here are still original. They're not used a whole lot anymore, but they're still there in case it's needed. The light board is still original to 1925. This is the stage door right here. If you saw that big yellow ramp in the parking lot, that's where it leads out to right there. The original stage door was over here in the corner by this tall ladder. It's been bricked up since, but that was originally kind of like a 2-lever cantilever type system. Once they had the parking lot available starting in the 1960s, they decided to make it a lot more efficient, put in a new stage door with a ramp that makes loading in, loading out a lot easier. Originally, there was a paint bridge right over these radiators right there. Back when you had a lot more theater productions on this stage, they had to build and maintain sets on a regular basis. Gradually, as that became less and less the case, the bridge kind of lapsed into it wasn't used very often, so they decided at one point to just tear it out. And the stage has been resurfaced a few times. It'll be resurfaced again sometime this year. But by and large, everything you see is still original to 1926, with the exception of the seats. In the late 1940s, they updated the seats. They made them wider. They eliminated a few sightline issues. They lost about 500 seats in the process, but other than that, everything else is largely still the same as it was in 1926.
We do have a full orchestra pit. So like many Broadway houses, if you take a look over here, not too close, and you see where the plywood ends, right? That's the end of the pit. And the pit actually extends under the stage to about here. So you can fit 80 or 100 band members under there playing for whatever you need. So the thing about box seats is that they're not intended for you to see the show, they're intended for you to be seen seeing the show.
But yeah, this theater, along with the Jack White Theater we just in, are still very much used for concerts. January is typically our slower time of the year. We don't get a whole lot of shows in here at that point. So it kind of gives us a little bit of breathing space to kind of rest and recover, as well as do some preventative maintenance. I mentioned the chandeliers, there's a few other things in and around the theaters that they typically do around this time period right here. Well, that concludes the tour for today. On behalf of the Detroit Masonic Temple Library, as well as the Docent Corps, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for spending part of your Sunday afternoon with us. We typically, like I said, we typically hold the tours on the first and third Sundays. We also hold special behind-the-scenes tours. Only have 15 people on the tour, but if you're ever interested in kind of a infrastructure type of building tour, you see a lot of stuff that we typically can't show on everyday tours. You see a lot of things that typically most don't get to see. So those pop up on the website. You might want to take a look at that. We also do custom date tours. Like I said, we typically need at least a week's notice for that. We do have group rates available for Masonic and nonprofit organizations. So as long as the date is available and as long as we have a docent available to give the tour, we can do that as well. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going on.